Do you love bread making but hate the waste that comes with maintaining a sourdough starter? Well, fear not, because with the zero discard sourdough starter method, you'll never have to throw away another bit of precious starter again or waste flour. So here's how it works. Let me give you the short version first. Basically, what you do is you keep a very, very small amount of starter, 5 to 10 grams total, not just 5 to 10 grams that you add with flour, water, and starter, but 5 total grams. I know, it sounds crazy. It's a tiny bit of starter. And then what you do is every time you want to do a recipe, you build it up to the size that you need. Use all of it in the recipe except for just a couple grams scraped inside the bottom of this jar to create your next 5 or 10 grams of starter. All of the discard ends up going into your recipes. And in all of that, I never, not even once, throw away any starter or any flour. Let me show you exactly how I do it. I've just pulled Elizabeth out of the fridge for this week's baking session, and I'm planning on doing 2 recipes. I'm going to do an artisan loaf, and I'm also going to do some everything bagels. So I've just taken her out of the fridge, and I'm checking the recipe to see how much starter is required for the artisan loaf, and it requires 90 grams of starter. So what you see me doing here is I'm starting a brand new fresh jar. I really only do this once a month. You can see my jar is very, very messy. And that's because cleaning the jar is a little bit of a hassle because you don't want to put that down your sink. So I have to do it outside. So I switch out jars just as infrequently as possible. But this is the week that I am going to be cleaning it out. And so I'm moving to a new jar. And I'm going to be building up my starter. I'm starting with 30 grams of starter. That's exactly how much I had in the fridge. This is unfed starter, which most people call discard. And now I'm going to feed it in preparation for my recipe. So since I have 30 grams of starter currently, I have 90 grams that I need to get to. And then I also need to make sure that I have enough left over that I can continue to keep my starter alive and use it in future recipes. So if I need 90 for the recipe, and let's say 20 that I want to leave behind for future recipes, that brings me to I need 110 grams of starter. So minus the 30 from the 110 equals 80. And then I'll take that 80 and I'm going to split it in half because I'm going to do half flour, half water. So that's 30 grams of starter that I currently have, 40 grams of flour that I'm adding, and 40 grams of water that I'm adding. All of that will equal the 110 grams, 90 for the recipe, 20 to leave behind so I can continue to use my starter. My math was probably a little bit off there because I'm not always precise when it comes to the grams, but that is okay. Sourdough is very forgiving. It doesn't care if it's 38 grams versus 40 or 36 grams versus 40. It's all pretty much the same to it. A lot out on the internet is going to tell you that you need to take what I had left, which was my 30 grams, and get rid of or throw away half of it, use it in a discard recipe, throw it away, whatever. But you don't really have to do that with a mature starter. If it's mature, the unfed or unrisen starter that's been in the fridge, there's nothing wrong with it. It just needs to be fed so that it can rise again. But I want to preface here that if you are starting with an immature starter, one that you have just created, and you're within those first 2 weeks of its creation, it is super important to actually throw away the discard. Because what's happening when a starter is being created is there's a battle between the good bacteria and the bad bacteria and lactic acid and all this scientific stuff that I don't even going to pretend to know. But I do understand that there is a fight going on between these different bacterias. And if you do not discard in the beginning of an immature starter, you're going to allow that bad bacteria to have a chance to overwhelm the good bacteria. That's when you're going to start to see things like mold happening or just really weird stuff happening. And that's because you need to help the good bacteria win the battle. And by the easiest way to do that is to split that starter in half, get rid of it, don't cook with it because it's not really good for that, and then continue to feed it and let it grow, and then discard, grow, discard, grow, discard. But that is only for immature starters. That's only for the first 2 weeks of the life of a starter. Once it is mature and it is doubling regularly, it's rising, it's doing all the things that it's supposed to do, you don't necessarily ever need to help the good bacteria overwhelm the bad again, because now it has accumulated enough of a colony of good bacteria that it would never be overwhelmed by the bad stuff again. That is, as long as you're continuing to use it and feed it and keeping it alive. So when I built up my starter right now, it was pretty close to a 1:1 ratio. It was 30, 40, 40. So 30 starter, 40 flour, 40 water. So since it was close enough, I marked a line of where it is on the jar, and then I'm just waiting for that to rise within 4 to 6 hours, which it did. And I was able to use that in my sourdough loaf recipe, and it worked out great. And here is that finished loaf. I'm going to put the recipe for my artisan loaf down into the description below. It is very forgiving. I've used it even when my starter was very young. I think I first started using this recipe when it was about 2 months old. And even though my dough didn't look quite like all the beautiful dough on Instagram and YouTube, it still works every single time. Now you do have to follow the steps very carefully, because if you miss one of those steps, it can cause the bread to not rise or become very, very dense. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to the bagels. If you remember, we had aimed to have 20 grams of starter left over. Well, I don't know what happens sometimes, but magically my starter numbers don't add up. I don't know if maybe it's just like there's a lot sticking to the jar or what, I don't know. But it ended up being, when I calculated it and measured it, it ended up being that I had 7 grams left. Now the bagels need 150 grams of starter, which is quite a lot. So we're going to do the calculation again. We need 150 grams for the recipe. We want to make sure that there's 20 grams remaining afterwards that we can use in the future. So that brings us to 170 grams. We currently have 7 grams. So 170 grams minus the 7 grams that we currently have brings us to 163 grams. If we then divide that in half, we're going to need 81 and a half, don't be precise, but 81 grams of flour and 81 grams of water, so that that way we can get it equal to the 170 grams we need. 150 for the recipe, 20 for the remaining starter to live on and bake another day. When you're building your starter from 7 grams all the way up to 170 grams, that is 12 times the size. So it needs to get very, very big. So we are feeding it a crazy amount, right? We're starting with the ratio of like 1, 12, 12 versus what the normal ratio should be, which is 1, 1, 1. So in our first recipe, the artisan loaf was more of a 1, 1, 1 ratio because it was 30, 40, 40. 30, 30, 30 would be the perfect 1, 1, 1, but close enough, right? Well, this one we're doing 1, 12, 12 because we have 7 grams and we need to add 80 and 80. This means that this starter is going to take a significantly longer amount of time to rise and to become active. So that normal 4 to 6 hours is not going to apply in this situation. When you're building up your starter from a very small amount to a very large amount, it takes much more time. And in this particular case, I did this in the evening. I went to bed, kind of slept in the next day, so it was probably a total of somewhere between 12 and 14 hours that it took for this to rise. Most recipes are going to tell you that the starter should rise within 4 to 6 hours to be considered mature. I know my starter is mature because when I feed it a 1:1 ratio, it rises in 4 to 6 hours. So I know that when I feed it these exorbitant amounts and it takes 12 to 14 hours to rise to double or triple, I know it's only because I have fed it this crazy amount. And it's okay. That is perfectly fine. So the next day I wake up, and I take my fed starter that has peaked and I add it into my recipe for my bagels. If you don't have plans to bake or you don't want to bake every day, there are other options, especially with using this zero discard method. So the way that you do that is once you've used your starter to make whatever recipe that you're making and you have that tiny amount left, somewhere between 5 and 15 grams of starter remaining, you're going to feed it equal parts, ratios 1-1-1. So if you have 5 grams, you're going to do 5 grams starter, 5 gram water, 5 flour. And then you're going to put a cap on it very, very loosely and just stick it in the fridge. And it will be good living in the fridge for a week like that. Some people have done it even longer. I've heard people that have left it in the fridge for months and it turns out fine. I like to feed mine weekly. Then all you have to do at that point is when you take it out to feed it or to refresh it, you can bake your items then. So I schedule mine to be fed every Saturday. Saturday is the day that I will bake anything that I want to bake. And usually the way that I schedule this is every week I bake something different. So one week I'm doing bagels, one week I'm doing an artisan loaf, another week I'm doing naan bread, waffles, sandwich bread, English muffin. I mean, really the sky is the limit with what you can make with sourdough. You can pretty much anything that you make with active dry yeast or just no leavening agent like cookies or pizza dough, you can use your sourdough for. Since a lot of sourdough products freeze really beautifully, I will make a large amount for that particular week. So I'm making bagels this week. It's probably going to take us 2 to 4 weeks to go through all these bagels. And so I take those bagels and instead of leaving them on the counter, which they're only going to last for 3 or 4 days, maybe a week in the fridge, I actually stick them in the freezer and they are good for a good solid 6 months. And then the next week I pull out and I make a loaf and I slice the bread and I stick that in the freezer. And then I pull out and I make waffles. We have some that morning and then we stick the rest in the freezer. When you take it out, I'm telling you, it tastes just like the day that you baked it as long as you allow it to thaw and maybe toast it or stick it in the microwave or something like that, and it's just wonderful. Or for some reason, if you don't feel like baking that week or your freezer is like mine and it is just full of all the products that you have been making over the last several weeks and you don't really need anything, you can just feed your starter and put it back in. You don't even have to discard. So since we keep such a small starter, right? So if we keep a 5-5-5, so 5 grams water, 5 grams flour, 5 grams starter, you have a total of a 15-gram starter. If you pull it out of the refrigerator, you have to do the equal parts again. Now you have your current starter, that's 15 grams. Now you're going to add 15 grams of flour and water. That's going to bring you up to 45 grams of starter. And then put it back in the fridge. Now, if you do this for a longer period of time, your starter is just going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you don't necessarily want to do that. But there are a couple recipes that if you did do that and it kind of got away from you and it's just gotten really big, crackers and crisps are 2 recipes that use a significant amount of starter, and it doesn't have to be fed. So you can straight pull it out of your fridge and take that excess amount that's been building up over the last 4 weeks and make crackers. I love making ranch crackers. It's just a simple sourdough cracker recipe, and I add Hidden Valley Ranch powder to it, and it is probably one of the most outstanding crackers I've ever made. And then the other way that you can use it is a crisp. So you literally take just the starter out, put it on a baking sheet, spread it very thin on like a silicone mat or a piece of parchment paper, sprinkle it with whatever seasonings you want, including salt, just the starter, and stick it in the oven at 375 for about 15 minutes, and it makes these little airy, crispy little wafers kind of, and those are great little snacks. If you find yourself in the cycle where you're not baking weekly and maybe the discard you don't want to use on crackers or crisps, the thing to do there is you are going to have to throw some of it away, otherwise it is going to accumulate and you're going to use lots of flour. The cool thing is by keeping a starter very, very small, you know, that 15-gram total starter. If you were to take half of it out, we're really talking about a tablespoon of starter that you're throwing away, a very small amount. Then you're feeding it a tablespoon of water and like a teaspoon of flour. And so this is a small amount. By keeping it that amount, the discard that you end up having to throw away because you're just not baking lately is so small that it doesn't really feel that wasteful. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that like button so that the YouTube algorithm offers this video up to other folks who might also be struggling with keeping a starter and dealing with all of that discard. Thanks so much for spending time with me in the kitchen today. Happy baking, guys.